From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
This is a good fun conference, isn't it? It's been really nice. I've been out of the archive world for a couple of years working in the commercial sector, so it's really nice to splash back down and see some familiar faces. So as Abby mentioned, I'm a designer, a software designer. I think I might be the first person to mention the D word up here, the design word. So I'm just going to spend a little time showing you some of the projects that I've worked on, which really are centered around providing access to digital materials. And then I want to show you a little bit of about the research I'm doing in my new business, and I'd love to hear what you think about all that. So this is a basic timeline of George, and actually I haven't been doing this for over 20 years because that would be aging me a little bit. It's just under 20 years actually, which is still a bloody long time. So, but I've worked on some great projects in those past 18 or so years, and a lot of them center on really big digital collections. And I'm really passionate about how design can increase access to materials, and even that access itself is a form of preservation. So one of the first big amazing projects I worked on was this photo sharing site called Flickr, and this is actually a screenshot of the homepage from about May of 2004. I'm not particularly proud of this layout, but it changed a lot over time. And Flickr, I don't have the exact number now, but I think there's some billions of photographs on there now, and it was a real privilege to work on that project. And I think the other interesting point, maybe for this crowd, is that we made no rules for the users of Flickr about how they should describe their content. And admittedly, photographs are an easy thing to both view and describe, but what we witnessed actually was a truly emergent classification system that created collections all on its own just by the way that people were describing their photos. And there was also a bunch of sort of auto-generated metadata, which was really useful too, like timestamps and such. But in 2007, I think, mid-2007, I got an email from Michelle Springer at the Library of Congress. Elsie was looking for a Web 2.0 partner with which to work to share their giant photo collection, which had actually been online on loc.gov for over 10 years. But the tricky part, the sticking part, was that the licenses that Flickr offered couldn't accommodate the Library of Congress content because they had stuff that had no known restrictions. So I worked with Michelle to change the licensing on Flickr and the Yahoo legal department to accommodate this new type of content. And I ended up designing this thing called the Commons because I just suspected that there are many other institutions out there in the world who are struggling with similar problems of where to publish their stuff. And the Commons has grown, is still alive, which is really makes me happy. But there's some millions of photos there now, especially thanks to the British Library's giant mega dump of about a million photos and books and stuff. I think it was sometime last year. This is a photo of a woman called Marjorie Lawrence from 1939. It's in the State Library of New South Wales collection. I mean, there's tons of photos I could have showed you, but I like this lady because she smiles. And I was just curious, does anyone here have content in the Commons? Yeah, I'd love to hear your tales after the talk. But this is an updated screenshot. This is around about the time that I left, and you can see that it's a designer's prerogative to put a picture of herself on the homepage. But the sad news is that Yahoo determined in their ultimate wisdom to lay me off. I spent 2008 building this Commons program and actually sort of separating myself from the core Flickr development team, which in hindsight was possibly an error because they were easily able to snip that cord and let me go. and I must admit I'm still a little sore about it, even after 6 years, but it's certainly helped me realise that I never want to work for such a giant company ever again. So that was good. But I was heartened to see that Yahoo Labs, which I'm not sure who works at Yahoo Labs, but they constructed a bundle of photographic content from Flickr. I think there's something like 100 million photos in there, and with all their accompanying metadata, and they released that onto the web as a thing that could be consumed. So I was heartened about that, because when I got laid off, I was immediately pretty scared about the future of this enormous photographic archive and what was going to happen. I actually fantasize about making flickr.org one day, but I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not. But then I moved on to another amazing non-profit called the Internet Archive, which I'm happy to have heard mentioned a couple of times at the meeting, which I was happy to hear Mitch from New York Philharmonic say that he's using to display archives from the Philharmonic. Yep, right on, Mitch. But that's great. I mean, that's what you do this for, is so people will be able to use it. But the book read is open source, and you can grab that code and insert it into your own sites if you have any sort of bookish content to show, and it's all just done for you. But I think that actually the project I'm proudest of in terms of design and accessibility is the Understanding 9/11 archive. I don't know if you've seen this project. It's just archive.org/9/11. But the Internet Archive surreptitiously has been recording TV for, pre-9/11 from all over the world. And this was an encapsulated archive of about 3,000 hours of TV across the week following 9/11, from about 20 international channels. So you can see this layout here. It's time moving from left to right, and channel going up and down. And you can see the very leftmost column is 8 a.m. on Eastern Standard Time. And if I just zoom in a little bit, you can start to see how this just intense event, just rippled throughout the world, throughout the TV news across the world. And I mean, it feels a bit crass to say, but I'm actually really proud of this interface as well, because it makes it really easy to quickly zoom around such a lot of video content. So if I click on one of these thumbnails, I zoom into a 10-minute segment, and then so there's a thumbnail at that point for every 30 seconds of footage, and if I click on that thumbnail, I can watch that TV from that moment, the 30 seconds. And this is when President Bush was making that first announcement at the elementary school, which is super intense to rewatch even now. So actually what I enjoy most about this archive now, because the first few hours of imagery is so harrowing, is seeing how the world processed that event, 3, 4, 5 days out. The archive just sort of turns into a bunch of talking heads just going, what the hell was that? And we also made a physical representation of this too, which is, I guess, a form of data visualization all of its own. But it was really quite a visceral and interactive way to absorb all this content really quickly. Then I set my sights on another Internet Archive project, which is called the Wayback Machine, which is an incredibly large digital archive of the internet, basically. But what I tried to do was just sort of simply represent the activity of the crawler itself. So you see there's a timeline up the top, which shows you when the crawler was asking for the websites, and you can see just a simple calendar view that's interactive too. You can choose any of those days and look through to the material itself. So that was a fairly quick tour of the Internet Archive projects, but each hopefully using just straightforward interaction design, clear information design to increase access to the content. And then I went to work for this guy. His name's Eric Rodenbeck, and he runs a studio in San Francisco called Stamen Design, which has been around since about 2001. I joined Stamen as the art director, and in the last couple of years I've worked on about 60 or 70 different projects for different clients. So every project was different, and I'm sort of it was really a lot of work and pretty intense, but I learned a lot. I'd just quickly like to show you a couple of favourite projects, again using this idea of design and visualization to increase access. This is a project that I thought some of you actually might be interested to try. If you have any maps on any of your websites, you can use MapStack to make the map look the way you want it. You can change the colour, you can change the data layers. This is a sort of an ugly version of approximately where we are in the world. But you can see there's a whole bunch of Photoshop-like layers on the left-hand side that allow you to change the appearance of the map on the right. This is another project called Surging Seas, which comes out of a non-profit in New York called Climate Central, and they have a lot of data about sea level rise in the United States. So we made this interactive tool. You can see on the left-hand side there's a water level marker that's actually a slider. So you can actually see how the sea levels predicted to rise in certain areas. And they also have a bunch of other data to overlay on that around issues like social vulnerability, ethnicity, and that kind of stuff. So it's quite a visceral tool to help you understand which communities are going to be affected when sea levels rise. You know, actually, I've got a bit of a cold, and I actually considered coming up here with a tissue stuck up my nose until I realised that this video is going to be preserved by the Library of Congress, and then I thought, maybe I better not. So sorry if I'm coughing a bit. And the final Stamen project, which is also sort of a interface onto a large data set, was made for the Chesapeake Bay program, who actually, you might like to look into the way that they publish their data and talk about their data. It's a non-profit, obviously centred around the Chesapeake Bay, but they do a really good job as an organisation, sort of describing and sharing their data. But here what we're looking at is subaquatic vegetation health across the whole Chesapeake Bay. And I think my favourite part about this project is this gorgeous bathymetry data, which we were able to render like this into this beautiful map. So, but then something crazy personal stuff happened. I finally got a green card for the United States, so woo! And they hide it in this sort of scary envelope, which tells you immediately that you're scanned a lot of the time, and you better use this envelope if you want to remain private, which is a bit scary. But the great thing about the green card was that it let me resign from my job. So I felt a bit sorry for Eric, but I probably would have resigned from any position that I held at the time, just because I was finally free of having work visas and stuff. So June the 20th was my last day. And now I've got this tiny little business called Good Form and Spectacle. But now that I'm sort of coming back into the world of cultural heritage, because I want the business to serve the cultural heritage sector, I'm coming back and meeting with you again and catching up on what I've missed over the last few years. And I'm so excited because the world's changed, it turns out. When I was working on the Commons, a lot of what I would encounter was a lot of fear around sharing materials, and that's declining rapidly. Again, we've talked a little bit about trust. We began to touch on it in the last session, how you need to trust the people who are giving you content, and this general feeling of trust is increasing, which I think is so encouraging. And just the number of projects that are happening across different organizations, within different organizations across the world, I mean, it's literally off the chain. All these projects that are happening all over the web, it's so much, it's too much to keep up with. So it's a very exciting time to be sort of diving back into this and seeing how I can help with design. But I want this new business to be about these things primarily, because basically that's what I know. But I want R&D to be a big part of this, and I'll just quickly show you a bit of the R&D that I've been doing so far, which you'll probably think is amateur, but that's what a designer gets to do. She can be a professional amateur in all kinds of different spheres, which is super fun. So anyway, I launched it from my kitchen table on July the 1st. This is the homepage. I may or may not have been wearing a dressing gown. I'll leave that to your imagination. But the freedom of working from home has been incredibly liberating. I was wearing clothes, so I was wearing clothes. And alongside, I've launched what I'm calling a work diary, which is really just an old-fashioned weblog. I don't know if you are familiar with that. But one of the things that I wanted to do was measure what happened when I launched, which is so important to digital projects. And that's also a topic I haven't really heard come up is sort of measurement of use. How do you know if people are accessing your materials and when? So this is a WordPress blog, and WordPress, the package, it just offers stats, which you've probably seen. So here's the big launch day. There it is. Boom. Look at that. Got a bit of attention. It was really nice. And I tweeted with a link back to the weblog on that day. So I got a bit of a bump. I'd sort of forgotten that people don't read blogs anymore, and they need Twitter to be told that there's something happening over there, so you should go read that. But really what we're dealing with here is a tiny number of views. It's only 483. Very, very welcome visitors, but it's a very small number. But here's the point. My talk was called Contending with the Network. And here's a list of all the software, both online and offline, which I used to make this thing. There's about 34 shards of data relating to the business that have been strewn across the internet. And that's only in about 30 days. So I think part of my role here is to give you a case study to maybe think about what it's like for people who aren't archivists in the real world, just getting stuff done, and how complex it can be to pull stuff around you. And the fact is that networks and network data is really hard to constrain. I'm actually sort of interested, there's one tool in this big list called IFT. It's called If This Then That. It's a really cool little web service that you can actually use to authenticate two separate services and then listen for a trigger on one service and then do something on the other service. It's very curious about that. And I'm wondering if that might be a way to start to interlink some of this stuff, some of this data. Anyway, the point is, this is a difficult scenario to capture as much as I want to do it. I don't know if you follow a guy called Paul Ford, F-Train. He's F-Train on the internet. Very clever and interesting writer about the digital realm, but he had this sort of great quote. Like, seriously, everyone is like an ecosystem of frameworks as a platform, as a service, but the fundamental problem is that this is a nightmare. But nonetheless, I've begun creating some metadata. This is sort of the tags that I've been using on the blog. But I sort of retracted from that giant software network problem and stepped away for a second because I didn't know what to do. And then I looked around in my physical world and wondered what I might be able to start describing, because I'm sort of interested in what a proactive archive means instead of a posthumous or, late archive. Like the flow we heard about before was kind of interesting. We have these data producers that then pass you a thing. But I'm wondering what I can do right up front to maybe help. So this is the first item in my physical archive. You can see there I'm using what's called a triple tag to describe it. But the interesting part was a member of my community who I happen to know personally, Paul, he said, "You're not going to go with that tag, are you? Why shouldn't you go with another one that's maybe a little bit more specific?" And I said, sure. So I've changed it. Now this is the canonical tag that I'm using for my archive. But I've put a couple of items in there already. This is the sort of articles of incorporation of a small business in San Francisco. This is the receipt where I paid for my fictitious business name registration with a Bay Area reporter. This is my first piece of mail. And if I'd been thinking any more deeply about this, I probably wouldn't have torn the envelope. But hopefully that's interesting to somebody in the future. The sad part is this is actually junk mail, but whatever. And now I'm coveting one of these machines, which is apparently a magical scanner that I can scan stuff in digitally. That's sort of weird that I'm coveting a digitization thing. I'm running a bit short on time, so I'm going to speed up now. I hope my speech isn't too fast. But another thing that designers really like to do is research. So what I've been doing for the last 3 weeks is trying to visit with as many what I'm calling institutions as possible, different scales, different types, different sizes, to meet with the folks who work there, hopefully, and hear about their work and what they're up to. The very first visit was the De Young in San Francisco, beautiful museum. I asked the lady at the ticket counter how many objects she had, and she didn't know. And I bounced around a couple of people until I got to the admin offices, and they said, oh, about 250,000. I said, thank you very much, I'll be on my way. The Grey Area Foundation for the Arts in San Francisco, very interesting and forward-thinking education centre. Counterpulse, San Francisco, it's a performing arts theatre. I'm actually doing some work with them, my first client, woo! I'm just going to have a look at their archive, actually, and help them with a plan to get it onto the web. They've got all sorts of plans for development of this old porn theatre into a really interesting multi-use space. The Chabot Space and Science Centre. Sorry, I'm skipping a bit fast. Actually, if you don't know the Museum of Jurassic Technology, you might like to visit. It's in LA. It's awesome. I stopped by mistake at the Museum of Death. I was driving from the Machine Project to my next destination, and I saw it on Hollywood Boulevard, and I just had to stop. This is Lady, a stuffed Afghan. Actually, the museum is a classic. I mean, I don't even know if they have any digital catalogue at all. It's a very old-fashioned cabinet of curiosities. It's a super grisly scene, though, so you have to really be in the mood to see disgusting photos of dead stuff, so just be prepared. And then I went to the amazing Pantheonic Getty Centre to round out the day. I've been documenting these visits, storing them on Flickr. I started a very basic database using Google Docs. And I was actually pretty surprised to see that these 2 visits came up top on Google. And I think that's maybe because I made the title of my blog posts these meta tags. So that was pretty cool. I'm going to start another one. Talking today will be at another part of the archive. And I'm going to make sure I tag it with Trevor Owens. Woo! Because you're awesome. But again, this content's also going to be pushed out onto the web, into a variety of different places, and like hanging on to that or recording that is tough. Okay, so to end quickly, I know I've only got a couple minutes left. There's a couple of general things that I'm thinking about and interested in, and I'd be really curious to hear from you about. This is another unconference. I think it maybe is the first unconference. It's the Foo Camp that happens in Sebastopol every now and again. And I actually ran a session there called Do Good and Make Money, because I'm an entrepreneur. I'd like this thing to help me make money. But I've been researching different sorts of models where a for-profit and a non-profit can actually be symbiotic instead of parasitic, which I think happens mostly. And there are a few different models, like a software company could donate its IP to a .org of the same name, and then that the .org can own that IP and use it as an asset. There's all kinds of models. It's just something I'm exploring, and I'm sorry I'm running out of time. But I'd be really interested to hear from the experts in this room about positive collaborations that you've had with commercial entities, where there's been sort of mutual benefit. And just to end on a really inspirational book for me. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Orhan Pamuk, but he's from Istanbul, and he's actually made a museum all on his own in Istanbul. And this is a book called The Innocence of Objects, which describes the process and the museum itself. And in the book he proposes a very modest manifesto for museums. And this is a photograph of the slide of that manifesto. But I just kind of wanted to end on this note where, the people that I've met and the discussions that I've heard today are about very large data sets, extra galactic distances, national this, national that. But I think the trend maybe that is upon us is that individuals like me are trying to work in this space as amateurs, admittedly, and I know that you can help me with my practice, but I think generally we're moving towards the personal and the individual, and it's perhaps just something to consider, because a lot of the data that's moving around this room, I think, is at the institutional scale, but I think there's a lot of interesting human individual stories that are right there for you to capture as well. And this is one of my favorite artists, actually. Her name's Tomoko Sawada, and this is a piece called ID 400, where she, as an individual, it's her in all of these passport photos, and she's used makeup, hair, clothes, her facial expressions to represent herself as these seemingly different women. And that's an idea that I'd like to explore in a major research project I'm taking on next year. I'd like to open something like a tiny museum as a practice, as a research and development project, in order to explore its faculties and its trials and tribulations in order to learn. I would love help. I'm going to need help. You've seen my archival practice right now, and it's pretty pretty basic. So, yeah, I'm very curious to be back, and I'd love to help you with increasing access to your collections if I can. I'm sorry to end a little short, but that's my talk. Thanks. I don't know if we have time for a question.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions?
Okay.
Not a question, but a comment. I don't know whether you're familiar with the Center for Land Use Interpretation in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an organization that I think would really benefit from talking with you, because you know they're both a concept and a real thing, and what they document, it's really hard to get to physically, and largely in some instances doesn't even exist anymore.
Right.
So I could imagine you're having a perspective they'd find very useful.
Thank you. Do you know anybody there I could talk to?
Well, I'm a life member, so I can hook you up with someone. Yeah.
Great. It's okay if they're not. Oh, yeah, yeah.
So one of the things that libraries have been telling themselves for a long time is that we need to do more usability studies, and you know, user-driven design and you know, testing and so forth. And some of us have tried to do that, not all that successfully in many cases. But how do you think about usability and design together? Because they don't always necessarily fit neatly. That something that can be really brilliant and wonderful online may not, you know, meet all the usability requirements that we sometimes impose on ourselves. So just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah. It's always useful to watch people use what you've designed. Even if you're not a designer, like all of the presentations we've seen throughout this conference have been designed. I've always find it informative to just watch somebody use things, because they'll do stuff you don't anticipate, and they'll not understand things you think are so clear. So that aspect of usability testing I think is really important. On the other side of the coin, I think it can be a bit destructive, actually, usability testing, because sometimes, you know, I'm just generally skeptical of focus groups, because I think they're such a sort of petri dish of, it's like, you know, you can write a survey to make anybody answer it the way that you need them to answer it, kind of thing. I think it's a little bit like that. But if you've got individuals that you can work with, like your sister or your husband, you know, they can be testers for just that knee-jerk, do you understand what it is that you're looking at thing. With library systems in particular, well, with the Open Library Project at least, the design challenge that I presented myself was to imagine a library catalogue that didn't have a search box. You know, because library catalogues are so deterministic like that. You know, the only way into them is to search for something. But you know, it's so nice to browse the stacks and see what books next door, and you know, all the stuff that comes from being in the space. So I think the challenge for libraries is to represent their materials in a way that doesn't require search all the time, because people might not know where they're looking for, especially if they're doing research, you know. So that's one suggestion. But it's always nice to work with a designer, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a designer, but you know, our job is to solve problems for people, right? And whether we do that with a visual design or a piece of software or an exhibition or whatever, hopefully libraries want people to find their materials, and maybe designers can help with that. I don't know how many libraries actually employ a designer. Yeah? One? Well, I mean, the lady before who was talking about digital archivist positions increasing, I mean, maybe you could consider hiring a contract designer for a few months and just seeing what happens. I mean, at the archive I was able to work on those pretty major projects over the course of 2 years and increase access to them, you know, so maybe it's worthwhile. Not me, it doesn't have to be me. Okay, thanks everybody.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.